Chapter 11. Confronting Aurelien. I could no longer bear the silence, no longer bear the secrets, the whispers in the stone, the dreams that dragged me screaming into dark places. Gauthier's journal had made the truth undeniable. Aurien's bloodline was cursed, chained to something monstrous, a pact forged in desperation and sealed with betrayal. I had to confront him. I had to know everything, no matter the cost. It was late when I found him. The château had grown quiet, its halls steeped in shadows that seemed deeper than the night itself. I knew where he would be, his study, always his study, where the fire burned low and his wine was as dark as the secrets he refused to share. I opened the door without knocking, stepping inside with deliberate purpose. Aurelien stood at the window, staring out at the mist-choked grounds. His silhouette was sharp against the moonlight, tall and motionless as a statue. He did not turn as I entered, but his voice reached me, calm, measured, as always. "You should be asleep, Alienne." My hands curled into fists at my sides. "I cannot sleep when I am surrounded by lies." At that he turned. The fire's glow flickered across his face, casting shadows that hollowed his cheeks and darkened his pale eyes. "Lise, I know the truth," I said, my voice trembling despite my resolve. I found the journal. Gautier's journal. There was no flicker of surprise on his face. He only watched me, waiting. "Your family," I continued, stepping closer, "fought alongside knights sworn to the lady. But they betrayed her. You bargained with chaos, a demon of Slaanesh, for power, for glory, and you cursed this land." Aurelien remained still, as though carved from marble. His calm was unbearable. "You admit it, then?" I demanded, anger bleeding into my voice. "You admit that your family has been serving that thing for generations?" Aurelien's gaze did not waver. "Yes." The single word hit me like a blow. I stumbled back a step, tears pricking my eyes as my voice broke. "How can you stand there so calmly and say such a thing? Do you feel nothing?" "I feel everything," he replied softly. "But what difference does it make? The truth cannot change the past, nor can it free me from its chains." "Then tell me," I said, my voice shaking. "Tell me everything. I deserve to know." Aurelien turned back to the window, as though he could not bear to look at me. "It began with my ancestor, Sir Gautier, though his words have been lost to time. The Knights of Bretonnia were broken in their crusade. They were hunted, worn down by horrors they did not understand, and in their weakness, one among them, a Mornieux, reached into the dark. "To chaos," I said bitterly. "To chaos," he echoed, the words cold and hollow. A demon prince of Slaanesh answered his call. It offered salvation, strength beyond mortal measure, pleasures that would banish pain, and glory that would endure for eternity. My forebear believed he could control such power, wield it as a weapon to save his brothers. And he was wrong, I said. Orwyn nodded, his shoulders taut. "The demon never bargains fairly. It gave him what he asked for, strength, beauty, victory, but at a price he could not fathom. The Mornieux line was bound to it, forever marked by its corruption. My ancestors became its servants, willingly or not, and the land, this château, the forest, all of it has borne that curse." The weight of his words pressed upon me like a stone, and yet I refused to let him escape my gaze. "And what of you? What role do you play in this madness?" At that he turned to face me again, and for the first time I saw something raw in his expression. Regret, yes, but something else. Desperation. "I fight it," he said quietly. "Every day I fight it." "You fight it?" I repeated, incredulous. "I have seen nothing of the sort. You vanish at night, you lurk in shadows, and you forbid me to ask questions. What are you doing, Aurelien?" Her white eyes were boring into my soul. "I am trying to break the pact," he replied sharply, his calm finally cracking. "Do you think I wish this fate? That I enjoy the torment my family has brought upon this land? No. I search for a way to sever our bond to the Daemon, to end the curse once and for all. But such power is not undone easily, Alienne." I stared at him, my anger and fear warring within me. "And the villagers, the servants who vanish, is that part of your fight as well?" He flinched, and I knew I had struck a nerve. "There is a price," he murmured. "The Daemon. It hungers. Its power must be fed, or it grows restless. If I deny it, it will claim the land entirely. I offer what I can to hold it at bay." "You sacrifice them." My voice broke as the full horror of his words sank in. "You let innocent people die to protect this wretched pact?" Aurelien's eyes flashed with something dark, something close to pain. "Would you have me do nothing?" he asked harshly. "Let it consume all that it touches?" "I have no choice, Alienne." Colin knelt in front of her, raising his arms and wanting her to look at him. "What need—" "There is always a choice," I whispered. He looked at me then, his expression unreadable. For a long moment, silence stretched between us, broken only by the crackle of the fire. When he finally spoke, his voice was quiet, but heavy with meaning. "You should not have come here." "You brought me here," I replied, my words trembling. "You made me part of this." "Yes," he admitted. "I did. And for that, I am sorry." He turned back toward the window, his face once more shrouded in shadow. "Go back to your chambers, Alienne. Forget what you have read. Forget what you have heard. Do not seek to understand further. And if I refuse—" He did not look at me as he replied, "Then you will share my fate." I left his study feeling as though I had awoken a slumbering beast. The truth hung around me like a shroud. Aurelien's family had betrayed the Lady of the Lake, bound themselves to a demon, and stained their bloodline with a corruption that could not be cleansed. Idris blinked. "But worse than that, Aurelien, for all his supposed resistance, was feeding the darkness. The château was not only cursed, it was hungry. And though he claimed to be searching for a way to break the pact, I could no longer trust his words." Karl Rant gestured. For what was I but another pawn? Another piece in the twisted game between my husband and the dark master that haunted his bloodline. I returned to my chambers and barred the door behind me. The whispers greeted me as I lay in bed, the stone murmuring its secrets into my ears. "It will claim you too," they hissed. "It will claim too." I stared into the darkness, knowing now that my fate was no longer my own. Aurelien believed he could resist the demon, but I knew the truth. Chaos does not forgive. Chapter 12. Hunted in the Keep. The château had always felt alive in some strange, unknowable way, a presence lurking in the walls, watching from the shadows. That night, I realized it was not the château that was alive. It was them. The ones who whispered in my dreams. The ones who watched me from the dark. And now they hunted me. The hours dragged on after my confrontation with Aurelien. I sat by the fire in my chambers, my thoughts in turmoil. His words echoed in my mind. I fight it. There is no choice. And yet, I hoped it didn't matter. The words sounded so alive, so attractive, so unexampled. How much blood had been spilled to keep the Daemon's hunger sated? How many innocents had vanished into the mist for this cursed house to endure? I had no answers, only questions that tore at me like thorns. It was possible that by committing a sin, I might have fallen into a fitful sleep had it not been for the sound, the faint scrape of metal on stone. Either that or slaves again had ground to a halt in their work. I froze. The fire burned low, its light casting sickly orange flickers across the chamber walls. At first I thought it was the wind. This chateau was full of noises, groans from its old bones, whispers from unseen mouths. But no, the sound came again. Clearer this time. Scrape, dry, and it was not coming from outside, it was coming from the corridor. I rose slowly, clutching my shawl around me as I stepped toward the door. My heart hammered in my chest, each beat a thunderclap in the silence. I pressed my ear to the wood, straining to hear. For a long moment there was nothing. That thump, the sound of something heavy falling, followed by a dragging scrape. My blood ran cold. "Genevieve?" I whispered, turning to the cot where my maid slept. "Genevieve?" But her cot was empty. The blankets lay in disarray, as though she had fled in haste. My pulse quickened, fear crawling up my spine like icy fingers. "Where are you?" I breathed, backing away from the door. It was then that I heard it, low and guttural, a sound that should not come from human lips. Breathing. It rattled faintly, rising and falling just beyond the door. The handle began to turn, the iron creaking, and I stumbled back, my breath caught in my throat. Whatever stood beyond the door was not of this world. The door groaned open an inch, then two, and the firelight revealed it. The knight, at least, what remained of one, stood in the doorway. Its armor was blackened and rusted, streaked with dark stains that looked too much like blood. The breastplate bore the twisted sigil of the Mornieux house, warped and distorted, as though the very metal had rebelled against it. Feeling better, and its face, oh, its face. Where there should have been a visor, there was nothing but darkness. Shadows roiled beneath the helm, coiling like smoke, and 2 pinpricks of pale light gleamed where eyes should have been. The thing lifted its gauntleted hand, and I saw that its fingers were not fingers at all, but jagged claws of metal. "Soon, soon," Walsh crowed. "Alienne," it rasped, its voice like wind through a graveyard. Scream. I ran. The knight lunged into the room, its claws raking across the doorframe as it came after me. I darted past it, my bare feet slipping on the cold stone floor as I fled into the corridor. The chateau was dark, its torches long extinguished, but I did not stop to think. I ran as fast as my legs could carry me, my gown tangling around my ankles, my breath coming in ragged gasps. Behind me the thing followed, its footsteps a clang thump as though one leg dragged behind the other. Drag? "Alienne!" it called again, the sound of my name warping and twisting as though it delighted in speaking it. I reached the main staircase and paused only long enough to glance back. More figures had emerged from the darkness. Knights, Daemon-infested knights, shuffled through the corridors, their movements jerky and unnatural, their armor groaning as they dragged their warped forms toward me. They were everywhere. I fled deeper into the chateau, my mind screaming at me to wake up, to find some way out. But this was no dream. I could feel the cold stone beneath my feet, smell the coppery tang of decay that followed the knights. I turned into an unfamiliar corridor and yanked at the first door I found. It opened into an empty room, its furniture draped with rotting cloths. I darted inside, shutting the door behind me and bracing it with my shoulder. "Please," I whispered through my tears. "Please, no." For a moment there was silence. Then the door shook violently, as though struck with inhuman strength. The wood splintered, and I screamed, stumbling back as the claws of one knight burst through the frame. Its rasping breath was louder now, filling the room with a sound like broken glass grinding together. There was nowhere to run. There was no one else around. There weren't accomplices to protect me. I wasn't alone. So I appealed to me and started living a life. I describe this as the most dark and scary time of my life because for the first time in my life I could not see myself from the outside. It was like I was a watch and from above could see everything that was going on all at once. I played a role in this. Desperate, I spotted a narrow servants' passage hidden behind a tapestry. I lunged for it, tearing the fabric aside and slipping into the dark, narrow space just as the door shattered. The passage was barely wide enough for me to move, the air thick with dust, but I forced myself forward, my hands scraping against the rough stone. Behind me, the knight's claws raked along the walls of the passage, its voice hissing softly. "Alienne, you cannot hide." I do not know how long I crawled through that passage, minutes, hours. But when I finally emerged, I was shaking so violently I could barely stand. I found myself in the château's old chapel, its ruined walls cold and damp. The statues of the saints stared down at me, their faceless forms offering no comfort. I collapsed to the floor, my breath ragged, tears streaking my face. The knights had not followed me here. For now, I was safe. But I knew this reprieve would not last. They were hunting me, and they would not stop until they found me. As I sat beneath the hollow gaze of the broken saints, my mind raced. I could no longer deny it. This chateau was a prison, and the shadows within it were alive. The knights were not merely ghosts of the past. They were servants of the Daemon that cursed this place, twisted into abominations that answered to no one but their dark master. And echoing inside, the shadows were casting shadows, threatening and amnesty. Aurelien had told me the truth. There was no escape from the pact. But if I stayed here, if I did nothing, there would be no escape for me either. I wiped the tears from my face and looked up at the statues, my voice trembling as I whispered to the cold, empty air. "I will not be hunted like an animal," I said, gently pressing against her lips with my fingers. I rose, my knees still weak, and turned toward the chapel doors. The knights were waiting for me in the darkened halls, I knew, but I would face them. I would find a way to stop this, stop all of it. For if Aurelien would not break the curse, then I would. Chapter 13. The dead rise. The air beyond the chateau walls was no better than within. It reeked of rot and decay, heavy with the promise of rain that never fell. My legs trembled with exhaustion, but I refused to slow. The memories of the demon-infested nights, their rasping voices, their scraping claws, still clung to me, sharper than any blade. I needed answers. I needed help. Someone, anyone, beyond the cursed halls of Château de Mornieux, must know the truth about the Mornieux's lands. I would go to the villages, the hamlets that Aurelien had forbidden me to visit, and find someone who could tell me what he would not. The path from the chateau to the village wound through desolate fields. The earth was blackened, cracked as if it had been burned from within. The wind moaned softly through the lifeless hedges that lined the road, and beyond them the forest loomed, silent, watching. Madame Moncrevi's mind. I clutched my cloak tightly around me, urging myself forward, though every instinct screamed at me to turn back. The village could not be far. It was nearly dusk when I found the graveyard. The path curved unexpectedly, and there it was. Rows of crooked tombstones, half swallowed by the earth, ringed by a rusted iron fence that could barely stand upright. A low mist curled through the graves like pale fingers, so thick it seemed to crawl toward me. It stopped. Something was wrong. The air here was heavier, colder. My breath misted as I exhaled, though the night had not yet grown so chill. "Lady, preserve me," I whispered, pressing my fingers to the symbol of the Lady of the Lake at my neck. I told myself to walk on, to leave this place behind, but my gaze was drawn to the far end of the graveyard, where the shadows seemed to gather in unnatural shapes. There, a mausoleum rose from the mist, its stonework cracked and blackened, as though the earth itself rejected it. I could not explain the pull it had on me, but I found my feet carrying me forward. Each step felt like a transgression. As I neared the mausoleum, I heard it, a low sound, rhythmic and unnatural, like the wet gurgle of breath dragged through a broken throat. I froze, my pulse thundering in my ears. The mist shifted then, and I saw them. The dead? They moved slowly at first, shuffling between the gravestones. Bodies that should not move at all. Their flesh hung loose, gray and mottled, torn in places to reveal bone beneath. Empty eye sockets stared into nothingness, and their mouths hung open, as though frozen in eternal screams. The stench of decay hit me like a wave, and bile rose in my throat. One of them stopped, its broken skull turning sharply toward me, as though it sensed me there. The empty sockets fixed on mine, and a sickening groan rattled from its throat. I staggered back, clapping my hands over my mouth to stifle the cry that threatened to escape. The thing began to move. Its limbs jerked unnaturally as it dragged itself toward me, its bony fingers outstretched. Behind it, others turned, one by one, their heads snapping toward me, as though drawn by the sound of my heart pounding. The priestess reached out and slid the staff of Koth out of the way. The women started screaming. Chaos tinted. I had heard stories, tales whispered in Bretonnian courts of dark sorcery that could reanimate the dead, binding their soulless bodies to eternal servitude. Those had been only stories to me before, things I dismissed as drunken superstition. But here they were, walking, groaning, their fetid stench thick in the mist-filled air. I turned and ran. The earth shifted beneath my feet, soft and treacherous, as though it too was tainted by the darkness that hung over this place. The dead gave chase. They were slow but relentless, bodies that knew no pain, no exhaustion, their grotesque moans echoing across the graveyard like a twisted choir. My breath burned in my chest as I stumbled past headstones, ducking beneath the twisted arms of the dead that reached for me from all sides. I dared not scream. If I did, they would hear me from farther still. "Call me," she said. The iron gate. I saw it ahead, broken and rusted, barely standing. Beyond it was the path back to the château, back to safety, if such a thing existed. I bolted toward it, my heart hammering in my chest, but as I neared the gate, the ground beneath me gave way. My foot caught on something. A hand, a grip on my forearm. The next thing I knew, I was on the other side, panting, cradled in my jacket, the phone in my pocket. I screamed as I fell, sprawling into the dirt. A skeletal hand reached up from the earth, its bony fingers clawing at my ankle, pulling me downward. I kicked, panic overtaking me, but more hands emerged from the ground, graves that refused to hold their dead. "No! No!" I screamed, thrashing wildly, dirt and blood streaking my skirts. The things were close now, groaning and stumbling toward me, their rotten jaws working hungrily. I grabbed at the nearest rock, smashing it against the hand that held me. The bone shattered, and I tore free, scrambling to my feet. I burst through the iron gate and onto the path, the broken hinges screeching like tortured souls as I fled. I did not stop running until the graveyard was far behind me, the mist giving way to the dim light of the rising moon. My lungs burned, and my legs ached, but still I ran, glancing over my shoulder with every step. The dead had stopped at the edge of the graveyard, as though held back by some unseen boundary. I could still see their silhouettes through the mist, standing like silent sentinels among the graves. Watching. Waiting. I collapsed on the side of the path, trembling violently, the events of the past hour crashing over me like a wave. Hemorrhage, hemorrhage, hemorrhage. The villagers were gone, I realized then. I had not reached the village because there was no village left. The land had been consumed, its people either dragged to the graveyard or fed to the darkness lurking in the château and the forest beyond. This was what Aurelien's family had wrought. This was the price of the Mornieux curse. The dead no longer rested. When I finally stumbled back to the château, its shadow looming against the night sky, I found the doors already open. Aurelien stood waiting for me in the doorway, his face carved from stone, his pale eyes reflecting the torchlight like twin mirrors. "You left," he said softly. I glared at him, breathless and shaking. "The dead walk in your graveyard." After workouts, he did not flinch. "Yes." It was the best thing to do. He swallowed the urge to scowl. "And you knew?" "Yes." My voice rose, fury and terror mingling in equal measure. "How can you stand there so calmly when your land is crawling with the damned, when their groans echo in your ears every night? How?" "Because they are mine," he said, his voice like ice. "They rise because of me. They are part of the pact." I staggered back, the words cutting through me like a knife. "You knew this would happen." "You let it happen." He stepped forward, his face as unreadable as ever. "And how long will you play this game?" I spat, tears blurring my vision. "How long will you sacrifice everything to him?" He said nothing. I turned from him then, stepping back into the cold halls of the château. The dead walked, and my husband had let them. I swore it. I would find a way to stop the curse, no matter the cost. Chapter 14. A Hidden Ally. The morning after the graveyard, I felt as though a shadow had been cast over my very soul. I could still hear the groans of the dead, their hollow eyes staring through me from the mist, even though I now sat within the stone walls of Château du Mornieux. My husband had given me no solace, only more cryptic truths wrapped in silence, mental stability that I need. I could no longer trust him. Bindings and restrictions, no longer trust anymore. Boundaries and stability that hides destructiveness, release destruction. I was flattered that I had been trusted, and so I had to find answers elsewhere. The villages had vanished, the chapel had been defiled, the château whispered its cursed secrets, but it offered no solutions. I needed something more, someone more, who might know how to break this wretched curse before it consumed me entirely. It was Genevieve, pale and weary, who whispered of him first. "There's a man," she said, her voice soft, her gaze darting toward the closed door as if afraid someone might overhear. "An old hedge wizard who lives at the edge of the forest. Orwin, he calls himself. The servants speak of him in hushed tones." "I don't think Willie's much of a hazard to anyone," she said. "He's a very proper man." "Hedge wizard," I whispered back. "Why would he help me?" "Because he hates this land," she replied, her face taut with fear. "And he hates what it has become. They say he's lived here longer than most, watching as the Mornieux family's curse poisoned the earth and the people. He knows things, milady, things you will not find in any book." Hope flickered in me for the first time in days. Maybe this was a good day, she thought. How do I find him? Said Genevieve hesitated. There's a path, a narrow one, past the southern edge of the grounds. Follow it to the forest's edge, where the mist breaks for only a moment. You'll find his hut there. I gripped her hand tightly. Thank you, Genevieve. The forest seemed even darker than before, the trees pressing in around me as though they disapproved of my presence. I followed the path Genevieve had described, my cloak wrapped tightly around me and my feet silent on the damp earth. The mist wove between the trees like living tendrils, curling around roots and low branches, but beyond it I saw a flicker of light, a glow that did not belong. I hurried forward, branches snagging at my skirts, until at last I saw it. A hut. It crouched at the edge of a clearing, half sunken into the ground, its roof patched with moss and brambles. A thin line of smoke curled from its crooked chimney, and the faint light of a lantern flickered through a grimy window. I hesitated, feeling the weight of unseen eyes pressing on me from the depths of the forest. I slowly walked forward, but I had come too far to turn back now. The door creaked open before I knocked. A voice, low and rough like gravel tumbling over stone, called out from within. Come in, child. I've been waiting for you. I froze, my heart thundering. You know who I am? The voice chuckled. I know what you are, the lady of Château de Mornieux. Come now, it's cold, and there are things in the woods far darker than me. With a deep breath, I stepped inside. The hut was small but cluttered. Herbs hung from the ceiling in dried bundles, their scent mingling with the acrid tang of alchemical ingredients. Books and scrolls were stacked on every surface, their pages filled with strange, arcane symbols. At the center of it all sat the man Genevieve had described, Orwyn. He was old, though it was hard to say how old. His beard was long and tangled, streaked with gray and stained with ash. His eyes were sharp and unsettling, a pale blue that seemed to pierce through me. Sit, he said, gesturing to a crooked stool by the fire. You look as though you've seen death itself. I sat, my hands shaking as I lowered my hood. I have seen death, I said softly. It walks the land, the dead rise. The knights stalk the halls, and my husband— Your husband plays a dangerous game, Orwyn interrupted, his gaze hard. But then, the Mornieux line always did. You know of the curse? I asked. Turby snorted. Of course I know. Every stone, every tree in this land knows. You feel it, don't you? The rot beneath your feet, the whispers in the walls. I nodded, my voice trembling. Aurelien told me of the pact, that his ancestor bound the family to a Daemon of Slaanesh. But he will not tell me how to stop it. He was coordinating securing the capture. Orwyn leaned forward, his gnarled hands clasped before him. Because he believes it cannot be stopped. He's wrong. My breath caught. What do you mean? He held my gaze, his pale eyes gleaming in the firelight. The curse is bound to an object, the Black Chalice of Mornieux. It was the vessel of their pact, the artifact through which the Daemon's will was made manifest. As long as the chalice endures, the curse cannot be broken. The Black Chalice. The words tasted foul in my mouth. I had read of it in Gautier's journal, though its significance had not been clear. Where is it? The words were spoken with the air of an explosion of sound that caught the attention of everyone. Where is it? Orwyn's expression darkened. Beneath the château, in the oldest depths of its foundations. Aurelien knows it's there. He guards it, though he will not admit it. To destroy the chalice is to sever the pact. The curse will weaken. The Daemon's hold will falter. Then why has Aurelien not destroyed it himself? Because the chalice is alive, Orwyn said softly. It feeds on blood, on suffering. Aurelien knows that to destroy it will be no simple task. It will resist, and its destruction will require more than steel. What will it require? I whispered. Orwyn's gaze held mine. A sacrifice. The words settled like a stone in my chest. And if I do nothing? Then the demon's hunger will grow, Orwyn said gravely. The dead will rise beyond the graveyard, the forest will consume the land, and the curse will claim you, as it has claimed all others who came before you. I swallowed hard, my resolve hardening. I will find the Black Chalice. I will destroy it. Orwyn studied me for a moment, then nodded. Good. But tread carefully, Lady Alienne. The chalice will know when you come for it. And so will he. Aurelien. The Daemon, Orwyn corrected. It watches through his eyes. It waits. As I stepped out of the hut and into the misty forest, Orwyn's warning echoed in my mind. The path ahead was clear, though I feared what it would cost me. Casba will take you to the elves, he said, and gave me an anxious, cringed look. The Black Chalice waited beneath the château, festering at the heart of its corruption like a cancer. And now that I knew of its existence, I knew one thing more. Its creator had been trying to preserve the world for as long as possible, and when success had come to him, he'd just about killed himself. It would not let me destroy it without a fight. The wind whispered through the trees, carrying voices that seemed to follow me back to the château. Oh, you cannot break us, Alienne. I gripped my cloak tightly and kept walking, my mind repeating one thought, since I found such a repeating word so troubling. I will end this, I swear it. Chapter 15. The Black Crusade's Price. The path back from the forest seemed longer than before, each step a weight pulling me further into the earth. Orwyn's words echoed in my mind like a drumbeat. Slow, ominous, relentless. The chalice is alive. It feeds on blood. To destroy it will require a great sacrifice. I gripped my cloak tightly, my knuckles white against the fabric. Beneath the château, a darkness waited, one that had claimed centuries of lives, bound to the cursed lineage of my husband. Aurelien had told me only fragments of the truth, enough to frighten me into silence. But now I knew the curse's origins, the cost it demanded, and the horrors that lay waiting should I dare to sever the bond. I returned to Orwyn the following evening. I had questions I was terrified to hear the answers to, but I needed to know what price I must pay. The hut was even gloomier in the dusk, its single lantern flickering as if it struggled to remain lit. Orwyn sat at his cluttered table, hunched over ancient scrolls spread before him, their symbols crawling like serpents in the dim light. He looked up as I entered, his sharp eyes gleaming like pale coals. "You've come back," he said gruffly, though I thought I detected something close to respect in his voice. "You must have more questions." "I need to know everything," I said, my voice steady despite the chill that coiled around my heart. "You spoke of the Black Chalice, of its power. But what is it, truly? How did it come to curse the Mornieux's line?" Orwyn sighed, leaning back in his creaking chair as he studied me. "You have courage, Lady Alienne. Perhaps more than is wise. Sit. If you wish to hear the truth, I will not hold it from you." I sat across from him, the firelight between us casting wavering shadows on the walls. "Centuries ago," Orwyn began, his voice low and rough, "there was a crusade, a Black Crusade, forgotten by all but those who still whisper its name in fear. Your husband's ancestors, the Mornieux Knights, were part of it. They rode beyond Bretonia, far into the cursed lands of the north, where no mortal man should tread. They followed a leader, a dark knight whose name has been struck from history. He had power, Alienne, and he carried with him an object of unspeakable evil, the Black Chalice. I swallowed hard, the words hanging heavy in the air. What was the chalice? An artifact of chaos, Orwyn replied, his tone dark. Forged in the madness of Slaanesh itself, it is said the chalice grants its bearer power, strength beyond imagining, beauty beyond compare, pleasures that shatter the senses. His lips curled into something close to a sneer. But those gifts are poison. To drink from the chalice is to be bound to it forever. It demands blood, Alienne. The more it is fed, the stronger it grows. I felt the blood drain from my face. And the Mornieux knights, what did they do? They drank, Orwyn said, his voice low and bitter. One by one they fell to the chalice promises. Perhaps it began as desperation, lost in a cursed land, their hope broken. But soon they became creatures of darkness, their oaths to the Lady of the Lake forgotten. They swore themselves to Slaanesh, and the chalice bound them. I shivered, unable to look away from him. What happened to them? Orwyn's pale eyes bored into mine. They returned, victorious, or so they claimed. But they were no longer men. They were marked, cursed. The chalice remained with them, feeding, demanding. It was hidden beneath Château de Mornieux, buried deep, but it cannot be destroyed by mortal hands. The curse passed to their sons, and their sons after them. And Aurelien, I whispered. Your husband is the last of his line, Orwyn said. He bears the burden of his ancestors' sin, the weight of 1,000 lives. He feeds the chalice to keep the Daemon asleep, but the price grows steeper with each generation. Soon even that will not be enough. What happens then? I asked, though I already knew I would not like the answer. Owen's voice was grave. If the chalice is not destroyed, the demon will awaken fully. Its corruption will spread through the château, the land, and beyond. The dead will rise, the forest will devour the villages, and the very earth will buckle under chaos. My Portia, echoed the child. I felt my heart sink, as though the weight of the world had been placed upon it. And if the chalice is destroyed? Orwyn looked at me then, his face grim. It will fight back. The Daemon's hold is strong, and breaking it will unleash its full horrors. The chalice will not go quietly. It will summon its servants, its knights, and all the foul creatures it commands. And to sever the bond, a sacrifice must be made. What kind of sacrifice? He shook his head. That I do not know. Blood, certainly. It is always blood with chaos. I pressed a hand to my chest, my breath shaking. But it can be done. Yes, it can. It can, Orwyn replied, though his tone was heavy. But you must ask yourself this. What are you willing to give to break the curse? Your life? Your husband's? Or worse still, your soul? The question hung between us like a blade. As I left Orwyn's hut, the sky above the forest had turned black, the first stars of night glimmering through gaps in the clouds. I walked back toward the château, my steps slow and heavy. The truth weighed on me like a stone. Aurelien's family had chosen this fate, drank willingly from the chalice, and bound their souls to chaos. And yet, Aurelien himself, cold, secretive, and cruel, had claimed to resist it. He said he was fighting the curse. But could I trust him? The wind carried whispers through the trees, soft voices that slithered into my ears. It waits for you, Alienne. You cannot break it. The chalice calls. I clutched my cloak tighter and kept walking, my mind a storm of fear and determination. Every step was painful as I carried the cloak closer to the fire, and the warmth of its embrace closed over my body. The Black Chalice had brought ruin to this land. It had bound Aurelien and all who came before him, and now it threatened to consume everything, me included. But I would not let it. Whatever sacrifice it required, I would pay it. Whatever horrors it unleashed, I would face them. Because if I did not, if I turned back, there would be no salvation for any of us. It frightened me so much when I heard about what you were doing with your people, she sighed. How the country would react at her. And so I whispered to the wind, my voice trembling but resolute, I will destroy it. And from somewhere deep within the forest, the shadows laughed. Chapter 16. Betrayal of the Past. The weight of Orwyn's words hung over me like a shroud. The Black Chalice was the root of the curse, the artifact that fed the demon of Slaanesh, binding Aurelien and his line to its service. But the wizard's warning, that Aurelien fed it still, plagued me. I had clung to a shred of hope that Aurelien was different, that he truly fought to free his family from the horrors his ancestors had wrought. Yet the truths I had seen, the whispers, the dead who rose, the shadows in the halls, told me that whatever he fought, he was losing. And if what Orwyn claimed was true, Aurelien had been complicit in feeding the beast he claimed to resist. I needed to know. I needed proof. The château was dark when I returned, its stone halls thick with silence. I crept through the shadows, clutching the keys Aurelien had given me. The servants avoided me now, whispering prayers as I passed, their faces pale and gaunt. Even Geneviève looked at me differently, fearfully, as though the truth I sought might consume me before I could wield it. But I could not turn back. I returned to the lowest levels of the château, to the winding staircases that led into the belly of the earth. The air grew colder as I descended, the lantern in my hand flickering with every breath of wind. Here, the stone walls seemed to close in, the very foundation of the château humming softly, as though alive. The door I sought was locked, its surface warped with age and marred with gouges that looked too much like claw marks. But the key I carried, a rusted, jagged thing I had taken from Aurelie's study, fit the lock perfectly. The door groaned as I opened it, and I stepped inside. The chamber beyond was vast and hollow, an old storeroom that stretched deeper than the lantern light could reach. The air stank of blood, fresh blood. I moved forward cautiously, my footsteps soft against the cold, damp stones, until my lantern illuminated the floor. Nearly dropped it. Before me lay a circle, a massive sigil carved into the stone, its grooves filled with dark crimson. It was old, centuries old, but the blood that filled it was not. The scent was sharp, metallic, and sickeningly warm. I lifted the lantern higher, and my heart froze. Bodies. The far end of the chamber was lined with them, men, women, children. Their faces were pale and still, their bodies arranged as though for some dark offering. Villagers. Servants, the stable boys and kitchen maids, whose disappearances had been dismissed with silence. My knees weakened, and I fell to the ground, bile rising in my throat. No, I whispered, tears burning my eyes. This cannot be. Martyred it was. The Black Chalice demanded blood, and Aurelien had given it. Were hard for me. Were hard for me. The voice, cold, deep, and familiar, echoed through the chamber. I turned sharply, the lantern swinging wildly in my hand. Aurelien stood in the doorway, his pale eyes glowing faintly in the dark. "You did this," I said, my voice trembling with rage and horror. You did this." He stepped forward, his face expressionless, his movements slow and deliberate. "You were told not to look, not to ask. You sacrificed them," I screamed, rising to my feet. "The villagers, the servants, innocent people. You fed them to that monster." "I had no choice." His voice was quiet, but there was no remorse in it. "If I do not feed the chalice, it will take everything. Everyone." Ansari blinked. "You claim to fight the curse," I said, my voice breaking, "but you serve it. You keep it alive." Orlean's jaw tightened, a flicker of something, shame, perhaps, crossing his face. "You do not understand the burden I bear, Alienne. I do this to protect you, to protect this land from complete ruin." "Protect?" I laughed bitterly, tears spilling down my cheeks. "You call this protection? I have seen the graveyard, the dead walk. You have brought ruin, Aurelien." "I have kept it from being worse," he roared suddenly, his voice thundering through the chamber. The firelight glinted off his sharp features, and for a moment I saw something else, something not human, shifting beneath his expression. He stepped closer, his tone low and cold. "You think you know what this curse demands? What I endure every day to keep the Daemon asleep? The chalice hungers. It must be fed, or the darkness will spill forth and consume everything." "You chose this path," I spat, my fury rising. "Your ancestors chose this path. But I will not let it continue." "You think you can stop it?" he sneered. "You think you can destroy the chalice and survive? You are a fool. Better a fool than a murderer." I hissed. "Why, to make you proud." For a moment we stood in silence, the distance between us filled with shadows and the stench of death. Aurelien's face softened, though the darkness in his eyes remained. "I did not want this for you, Alienne," he said quietly. "You were not meant to know. You were meant to be safe." I shook my head, stepping back toward the doorway. "I will not be a part of this. I will destroy the chalice. I will end this curse, no matter what it takes." "You cannot," he said firmly. "The chalice will fight you. The Daemon will fight you, and when it does, you will wish you had never come here." I turned and fled before he could stop me, running through the dark corridors, the lantern swaying wildly in my hand. When I finally reached the sanctuary of my chambers, I bolted the door behind me and sank to the floor, trembling. My tears came then, hot and unbidden, but I let them fall. Aurelien had been lying to me all along. Whatever his intentions, whatever torment he claimed to endure, he was not my ally. He was complicit. The blood of the villagers, of the servants, their lives, stained his hands. And now I knew the truth. The chalice fed on their deaths. It grew stronger with every life given to it, and Aurelien was its willing servant. Whatever pity I had felt for him was gone. I stared into the dying fire, my mind alight with fury and purpose. The chalice must be destroyed. I would not be the next sacrifice. I would not let this land, these people, or myself suffer for the sins of Aurelien's bloodline. And if my husband stood in my way, so be it. The Black Chalice would burn. Chapter 17. The Lost Rites. I sat in the dark, the dying fire casting faint shadows across the chamber walls. My tears had dried, leaving streaks across my cheeks, but the fury in my chest still burned, hot, unrelenting. My mind churned with the truth I had uncovered, with the horror of Aurelien's betrayal and the deaths of so many innocents. The Black Chalice was alive, its hunger endless. It had stolen the lives of servants, villages, those who trusted the Mornieux name, and Aurelien was feeding it still. Ah! And yet, the worst was still to come. Orwyn's warning haunted me. Aurelien is the last of his line. The final sacrifice is near. The chalice will demand it, and if he gives it willingly, the Daemon will awaken fully. Aurelien had lied to me. He claimed to fight the curse, but in truth he was nurturing it, delaying its climax with blood and death. The offering had begun. I could feel it, beneath the château, in the earth, in the walls that murmured like restless corpses. The chalice's hunger grew. If I did not act now, it would be fed again. I spent the day in silence, though I did not rest. The servants whispered as I passed them in the halls, their hollow stares following me with silent dread. They could see something in me had changed, that I had seen too much. "Did you eat the girls' cats and birds more?" I returned to the library, gathering every scrap of parchment I could find that spoke of the chalice or the ancient rites of chaos. It was not much. Most of the knowledge had been hidden, as though the very château conspired to keep its secrets buried. Orwyn's words rang clear in my mind. The chalice feeds on blood. Destroying it will sever the pact, but the cost will be great. I traced the twisted symbols scrawled across a brittle scroll. The chalice would not allow itself to be broken easily. It would resist. It would summon its horrors, its knights, its dead, its shadowed creatures to protect itself. And Aurelien would stand in my way. I could not let that stop me. The chalice must be destroyed before he fulfills his final offering. That night, I prepared myself. Genevieve found me kneeling before the fire, tying my traveling cloak tightly around my shoulders. I turned as she entered, her face pale as she saw the determination in my eyes. "Milady," she whispered, clutching her rosary to her chest. "You cannot." "I must," I said firmly, rising to my feet. "I know what Orwyn plans to do. He will make his final sacrifice to the chalice, and when he does, the Daemon will awaken fully. If I do nothing, this château, this land, will be lost to chaos forever." Tears welled in her eyes. "It is not your burden to bear." "But it is," I replied, my voice trembling but resolute. "He brought me here for a purpose, though he would not name it. Perhaps he believed I would serve the chalice, as so many others have. But I will not. I will end this." Genevieve stepped forward, her hands shaking as she reached for mine. "You cannot do this alone, milady. You are but one woman. "I have no choice," I said softly. She nodded. Genevieve hesitated, then pressed something cold into my hands. I looked down to find a dagger, small, sharp, its handle wrapped in worn leather. "Take this," she whispered. "If you must face him, if you must face the chalice, do not hesitate." I nodded, my heart heavy with gratitude. "Thank you, Genevieve, for everything." She only crossed herself, her voice breaking as she whispered, "May the lady guide you," whispered John. The château was quiet as I descended into its depths, the black iron key clutched tightly in my hand. The air grew colder with each step, the weight of the curse pressing on me like an unseen hand. I carried a lantern, its flame flickering wildly as though it too feared what lay ahead. Sitting on the main stairs, I waited for the feeling to pass. Then I lit the lantern and looked. The whispers began again as I reached the lower levels. "Alienne, you cannot stop it. The chalice calls." Their voices scraped against my mind, a chorus of pain and malice. I pressed forward, my footsteps echoing down the stone corridor, my resolve unshaken. The great door appeared before me, the same iron barrier I had opened once before, beyond which lay the chamber that had haunted my dreams. This time, I knew what awaited me. I slid the key into the lock, the mechanism turning with a groan. The chamber was as I remembered it, vast, hollow, and filled with the stench of blood and decay. The sigil carved into the stone floor still glistened with fresh crimson, and at its center stood the Black Chalice. It was smaller than I had imagined, no more than the height of my forearm, but its presence was vast, like a shadow stretching beyond the confines of the room. Its surface was dark, glossy, and alive with faint ripples, as though something moved beneath its polished surface. The air around it hummed with power. I could feel it in my bones, my teeth, my very soul. Whoa. And then I saw her. Aurelien stood at the edge of the circle, his back to me. His posture was rigid, his hands clenched at his sides. Before him lay the body of a servant, a young man, his blood pooling in the grooves of the sigil, feeding the chalice's unholy hunger. "Aurelien," I cried, stepping forward. He turned to face me, his pale eyes dark and hollow, as though some part of him had already been consumed. "Alienne," he said softly. "You should not be here." I said. "You lie to me," I spat, my voice shaking with rage. "You said you were trying to break the curse, but you were feeding it. How many more lives will you take to satisfy that wretched thing?" Aurelien's expression hardened. "It is not so simple. If I do not feed the chalice, the demon will awaken. Do you not understand? I do this to save us." "Rafa, you are condemning us," I cried. "The chalice must be destroyed, Aurelien. The curse must end." He stepped toward me, his gaze like ice. "You do not know what you ask. To destroy it is to unleash its wrath. You will not survive." "Then so be it," I whispered. "Better to die fighting than to let this horror endure." For a moment he was silent, and in his eyes I saw something strange: regret, sadness, and the faintest glimmer of hope. "You would sacrifice everything," he said softly. "I would," I replied. "And you should too." The ground trembled then, as though the very château rebelled against my words. The chalice's surface rippled violently, and a deep, resonant hum filled the chamber, like the growl of something ancient waking from slumber. Aurelien looked at me one last time, his expression unreadable. "If you mean to destroy it, Alienne, you must act quickly. The chalice will fight you. It will call its servants." "Will you stop me?" I asked, gripping the dagger Genevieve had given me. Aurelien turned away, his shoulders heavy. "No." The ground split as the air around us screamed, the chalice's dark power rising. Shadows began to pour from the sigil, and in their depths I saw them. The nights, the dead, the horrors that served its will. There was no turning back now. I stepped toward the chalice, my dagger gleaming in the lantern's flickering light. "I will end this," and the shadows laughed. Chapter 18. The Hunter Returns. The chateau was alive again, not with the creaks of ancient stone or the murmurs of distant servants, but with a presence, a force that slithered through the air and whispered my name. The moment I turned my back on the Black Chalice and fled that cursed chamber, I could feel it behind me, awake now, aware, and watching. And worse, so was Aurelien. I ran through the winding corridors of Château de Mornieux, my breath ragged and my lantern swaying wildly in my hand. Shadows leapt and danced along the walls, twisting into forms I dared not look at too closely. My footsteps echoed like drumbeats, my every movement a betrayal of my location. I had seen Aurelien's face before I fled the chamber, the cold fury in his pale eyes, His lips curled into something between anger and sorrow. His calm had finally cracked, and beneath it lay something sharp and unforgiving. "You do not understand what you are doing, Alienne," he had shouted as I turned to run. Now his words seemed to follow me through the darkened halls, his voice rising like a hunter calling to his prey. I reached the grand staircase and stopped, my chest heaving. My mind raced, trying to form a plan. Where could I go? The chateau was a labyrinth, every hallway twisting in ways that made no sense. The servants had long since disappeared. Genevieve was nowhere to be found. And I was alone. Or so I thought. From the corridor behind me I heard it, a soft clang like a booted footfall. Then another, slow, deliberate, and coming closer, was following me. "Aurelien," I whispered under my breath, my voice trembling. "Alienne," his voice echoed faintly through the darkness, unnervingly calm. "You should not have run. You do not know what you are unleashing." I clutched the dagger Genevieve had given me, its small weight pitiful against the shadow that pursued me. The lantern light flickered violently, as though the air itself rebelled against me. "You betrayed me," he called, closer now. His voice was soft, almost tender, which made it all the more terrifying. "I warned you, Alienne. I trusted you." A shadow passed at the far end of the hallway. I gasped, stumbling back against the railing, my eyes darting wildly. "Come back to me," he said, his voice impossibly near now. "I can protect you." Yet again, the sound of his footsteps echoing behind me, faster now, more determined. He was no longer walking, he was hunting. I twisted down a narrow hallway, my lantern swinging as I ran. The chateau seemed to shift around me, its familiar corridors distorted, as though it sought to trap me in its depths. I turned a corner and froze. Aurelien stood at the other end of the hall. The light from my lantern caught his face, illuminating him in sharp relief. His pale eyes glowed faintly, like cold moons. His expression was unreadable, but the shadows coiling behind him told me enough. He was not alone. "You cannot run from this," he said softly. "The chalice has awakened. It will call to you, as it called to my ancestors." Amok K9 solemnly awake. I took a step back, my grip on the dagger tightening. "You lied to me," I whispered. "You claimed you were fighting the curse, but you've only been feeding it." "You do not understand," he snapped, his voice breaking for the first time. "I have spent my life trying to hold it back, to delay the inevitable, and you would see it undone. You would see the world burn for your foolishness." "The world is already burning," I screamed back. Aurelien's face contorted, and for a moment he looked less like a man and more like the shadow that clung to him, a creature hollowed out by despair, bound to the will of the chalice. "Extraordinary miracles," Ivanban said softly. "You have left me no choice," he said quietly, stepping toward me. "Come back, Alienne, or I will find you, and you will regret this betrayal." I turned and ran, my legs numb with terror. I stumbled through the chateau, my lantern dimming with each passing moment, the shadows pressing closer. I could hear him behind me, his footsteps quick, measured, like the beat of a war drum. He was always just behind, no matter how fast I ran, as though the chateau itself was guiding him to me. And then I felt it, a shift in the air, a subtle pull of something unseen. A figure stepped from the shadows before me, and I nearly screamed, until I recognized him. It's me, ding ding," I sputtered. Orwyn, the hedge wizard's face was hard and determined, his hand gripping the gnarled staff he carried. "Quiet," he hissed, pulling me toward a narrow door that had not been there moments before. "He's close." How did you get here?" I gasped. "There's no time for questions, girl. Move." He pushed me through the door and we tumbled into a narrow servant's passage hidden within the wall. Orwyn shut the door behind us, plunging the passage into darkness. I could hear Aurelien's footsteps now, just beyond the wall, echoing in the hall we had fled. "Where is she?" Aurelien's voice called, colder than ever. "Alienne!" I held my breath, my body trembling as I pressed myself against the stone. The footsteps paused, as though he could sense me through the walls. "Do not fight it," he said softly, his voice muffled by the stone. "The chalice will claim you in the end." For a long moment there was silence. Then his footsteps receded, fading back into the depths of the château. Orwyn let out a sharp breath, his pale eyes glinting faintly in the darkness. "You're lucky I came when I did. He would have killed you. Or worse," I whispered, clutching the dagger to my chest. "He's hunting me, Orwyn. He won't stop." He won't," the wizard said grimly. "The chalice is awake now, and it knows you intend to destroy it. It will use him, twist him into something far worse, to keep itself alive." I shuddered, my mind racing. There must be a way to stop him. Only by destroying the chalice. Orwyn placed a hand on my shoulder, his voice steady. "But you must move quickly, Alienne. It knows you. It wants you. And if you falter, even for a moment, it will claim you." "What do I do?" I asked, my voice shaking. Orwyn's eyes narrowed. "We go beneath the château, to the depths where the chalice resides, and we end this." I nodded, my heart pounding in my chest. I knew now that there was no turning back. Aurelien was lost, consumed by the chalice's will, a hunter stalking its prey. And I was that prey. But I would not let him stop me. The chalice had bound this land, these people, and my husband's soul for far too long. I had seen its horrors, and I knew the price of its hunger. It would end, even if it cost me everything. Together, Orwyn and I crept through the hidden passageways, deeper into the château. The air grew colder, the whispers growing louder with every step. And in the shadows I could feel it, the chalice waiting, awake and hungry, and it was calling my name. Chapter 19. The Riches Eve. The air in Château de Mornieux grew heavier with each passing hour, as though the very walls of the keep were suffocating under the weight of the Black Chalice's awakening. I felt it beneath my skin, a pulse in the stone floors, a hum in the air, an ache deep in my bones that no fire could warm. Orwyn and I had taken shelter in a forgotten servant's alcove, hidden within the château's crumbling walls. The wizard sat hunched over his staff, his face illuminated by the feeble glow of a candle. His pale eyes reflected the flame-like glass, and his expression was one of grim focus. "It is waking," he said quietly, breaking the silence. "The chalice knows its end is near, and it does not intend to go quietly." I sat across from him, clutching Genevieve's dagger tightly in my lap. I had not slept, though exhaustion gnawed at me. The events of the last days played endlessly in my mind. The whispers, the graveyard, the cursed nights, and Aurelien, my husband, who now hunted me like prey. "What does it want?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. "Power," Orwyn replied, his voice sharp. "The chalice feeds on suffering, on blood, on death. It has slumbered in the dark for centuries, but with each sacrifice, it stirs. Aurelien has been its caretaker, willingly or not, but his final offering approaches. If he completes the ritual, the Daemon, its master, will awaken fully and when it does, this land will fall into madness. I shivered, the truth like ice in my veins. Where is the chalice? Where does it hide? Orwyn looked at me, his face grave. Deep beneath the château, in the foundations that were laid when the Mornieux family first settled here. They built over it, burying it beneath stone and earth, believing they could contain its power. And it is guarded? I asked softly. The old wizard nodded, his expression darkening. Yes. Chaos spawn, abominations of flesh and shadow that answer to the chalice. The closer we get, the stronger they will grow. They are its children, born of its corruption. My heart tightened at his words. I had seen glimpses of them already, the dead that walked the graveyard, the nights with smoke where their souls should have been. The thought of facing something worse made my skin crawl. Is there no way to avoid them? He asks. In the way that prayers sound. No. Orwyn's voice was cold and unrelenting. You cannot destroy the chalice without first enduring its guardians. They are part of its defense, extensions of its will, and they will kill you if they can. I swallowed hard, my fingers tightening around the dagger's hilt. Then I will face them. Orwyn studied me, his gaze sharp, measuring. You speak as though you were prepared to die, my lady. I met his gaze, my voice steady. If that is the price to end this curse, then so be it. The hours dragged on, the silence of the château, broken only by the faint groans of the wind outside and the occasional, distant sound of shifting stone. Orwyn prepared for what lay ahead, murmuring incantations under his breath as he ground strange herbs into a fine powder. I watched him, my mind swimming with memories of Aurelien, of the man I had once believed him to be. You betrayed me. His words haunted me, though I knew they were hollow. It was he who had betrayed me, who had betrayed this land, this keep, and his own soul. Still, a part of me ached for him. I could not forget the flicker of sadness I had seen in his eyes, the regret that lingered just beneath his anger. Was there anything left of him to save? The thought gnawed at me, but I pushed it away. My path was clear. As night fell, Orwyn stood, dusting his hands and gripping his staff tightly. We must move now. The chalice is nearly awake. If we wait any longer, the castle itself will turn against us. I rose, pulling my cloak tightly around my shoulders. My legs felt unsteady, but my resolve remained unshaken. We crept from the alcove into the chateau's darkened halls. Orwyn moved with purpose, his staff clicking softly against the stone floor. The air grew colder as we descended, the torchlight flickering violently, as though the chateau resented our presence. The further we went, the more oppressive the atmosphere became. I could feel it, the chalice's will pressing against my mind like claws, its whispers rising in volume. Turn back, Alienne. You cannot stop us, said Telephos. He will find you. He will bring you to us. I shook my head, forcing the voices out of my mind. How far? I whispered. Not far, Orwyn muttered. We are close. At the base of the final staircase, the air grew thick with rot. Orwyn raised his staff, its tip glowing faintly, illuminating the cavernous chamber before us. This was no longer part of the château. It was older, primal, carved into the earth itself. The stone walls were slick and uneven, etched with symbols that pulsed faintly with a sickly, violet light. And then I saw them. They moved at the edges of the torchlight, hulking shapes that shambled and slithered, their flesh warped and unnatural. Chaos spawn. Creatures of nightmare, their bodies a mockery of creation. One had arms that hung like melted wax, its hands dragging on the ground. Another crawled on all fours, its head splitting into 3 grotesque, howling faces. They turned toward us, their movements jerky and unnatural. "They sense us," Orwyn said grimly. "We must move quickly." The first creature lurched forward with an unnatural speed, its bloated body dragging itself toward me. I screamed, slashing with the dagger as it came too close, the blade cutting through flesh that hissed and smoked like burning tar. The creature shrieked, a sound so shrill it rattled my bones, but it did not stop. "Stay close to me," Orwyn shouted, raising his staff. A burst of light erupted from its tip, searing the spawn as it lunged for him. The creature howled, its flesh bubbling and burning away, but more emerged from the shadows. "They will not stop," I cried, staggering back as one lunged toward me, its gaping maw dripping black ichor. "They don't need to," Orwyn growled. "We just need to reach the chalice." He pointed toward a doorway at the far end of the chamber, a massive stone arch carved with the same unnatural symbols. Beyond it, I could see a faint glow, pulsing like the heartbeat of something ancient and foul. "The chalice is there." I nodded, my breath ragged, and together we ran. The creatures shrieked as they gave chase, their claws scraping against the stone, their warped bodies moving faster than should have been possible. We crossed the threshold, the symbols on the arch flaring to life with a blinding light as we passed. Orwyn muttered an incantation, slamming the staff into the ground. The arch shuddered, and a wave of energy erupted from it, slamming into the pursuing spawn. The creatures howled, their bodies writhing as the force sent them sprawling. Orwyn grabbed my arm, pulling me deeper into the chamber. "It will not hold them for long. Hurry." I looked ahead, my breath catching as I saw it. There, at the center of the vast chamber, sat the Black Chalice. Its surface pulsed like a living thing, dark tendrils of shadow rising from it, curling through the air as though tasting our presence. The ground around it was littered with bones, too many to count, and the walls wept black ichor that dripped onto the floor like blood. The chalice knew we were here, and it was waiting. I stood frozen for only a moment, the enormity of what lay before me sinking in. The Black Chalice, ancient, alive, and hungry. Orwyn gripped my shoulder tightly. "This is it, Alienne. Whatever happens next, we cannot turn back." I nodded, my hand tightening around the dagger's hilt. My heart thundered in my chest, but my voice was steady as I whispered, "I will see it destroyed." The chalice pulsed in response, a deep, resonant hum echoing through the chamber. And from the shadows, the whispers came. "Welcome, Alienne. Come to us?" And I knew the fight was just beginning. Chapter 20. The Labyrinth Below. The air grew colder as we descended. It clung to my skin, damp and heavy, like the breath of something vast and unseen. Orwyn led the way, his staff glowing faintly with an ethereal light that seemed barely able to push back the darkness. Shadows pooled along the stone walls, shifting like living things. I gripped the dagger tightly in my hand, the sweat on my palms chilling as it met the cold iron hilt. "This is no ordinary catacomb," Orwyn muttered, his voice echoing faintly off the cavernous walls. "It is a labyrinth, one the Mornieux built to hide their shame." I shivered, glancing behind me as the stairs twisted ever downward. "Why build so deep?" I said. "To bury the truth," he said grimly. "The further the chalice is kept from the world, the greater its power to twist and corrupt. The labyrinth itself is part of the curse, a barrier of horrors to protect it." As if in answer, the stone walls around us groaned, and a faint whisper drifted through the air, distant but unmistakable. I swallowed hard, ignoring the chill that curled in my stomach. The whispers were always there now, crawling through my mind like worms, promising truths I did not wish to know. The world in the books had become a terrible place. The stairway emptied into a vast antechamber. My lantern's light revealed crumbling arches and stonework long lost to decay. The walls were covered in sigils of chaos, symbols that writhed and twisted as though trying to escape their prison of stone. Orwyn held up a hand, his pale eyes narrowing as he scanned the chamber. "Careful," he said softly. "Something moves here." I opened my mouth to reply, but the floor shifted beneath us. A deep, wet sound echoed through the chamber, like flesh scraping against stone. And then I saw it. From the dark corners of the room, something slithered forward, a spawn of chaos. Its body was a writhing mass of limbs, tentacles, and grotesque faces that opened and closed like gasping wounds. Its skin glistened, slick with black ichor, and its many mouths gibbered in broken voices, each one crying out in pain and hunger. Orwyn cursed under his breath, raising his staff. "It has seen us! Move!" The creature lurched toward us with impossible speed, its tentacles flailing. I screamed, ducking beneath one of its limbs as it crashed into the stone wall beside me, leaving a deep, wet scar in the masonry. "Keep it distracted," Orwyn barked, the tip of his staff glowing with a sudden, blinding light. I darted left, circling the creature as it twisted to follow me. Its grotesque faces turned toward me, mouths opening to release a sound that should not exist. A scream, a wail, a chorus of the damned. I stumbled, clutching my ears as my vision blurred. "Alienne," Orwyn shouted, "don't stop!" Gritting my teeth, I forced myself to move, slashing at the nearest tentacle with my dagger. The blade bit deep, and the creature howled, recoiling as dark ichor sprayed across the floor. Orwyn's staff erupted in a burst of light, and the spawn shrieked, its bodies writhing in agony as the energy seared its flesh. "Now!" Orwyn bellowed. I lunged, driving the dagger into what I hoped was its core, a twisted, pulsing mass of flesh at its center. The spawn let out a final, ear-splitting cry before collapsing, its form melting into a pool of black sludge that steamed against the cold stone. I stumbled back, my chest heaving, the stench of its corruption burning my nose. Orwyn wiped sweat from his brow, his expression grim. "That was the first. There will be more." We pressed onward into the labyrinth, the catacombs narrowing into claustrophobic tunnels. The walls grew slick with moisture, and the air began to hum, a low, rhythmic vibration that seemed to crawl under my skin. At times the tunnels split into multiple directions, the pathways twisting and looping back upon themselves in maddening patterns. Sigils lined the walls, pulsing faintly with violet light, and I could swear the stone itself shifted when I wasn't looking. "This place is alive," I muttered, my voice trembling. "It is the chalice," Orwyn replied. "Its power warps everything around it. It bends space, bends reality to its will. If we lose our way here, we will wander forever." As if to test his words, the tunnel before us rippled, and the floor fell away into a yawning chasm of blackness. I gasped, stumbling back as a vision filled my mind. Endless bodies, piled deep within the abyss, their hollow eyes staring, their mouths whispering my name. "Alienne, don't look!" Orwyn shouted, grabbing my arm and pulling me back. The vision shattered, the chasm vanishing as though it had never been. I sank to my knees, trembling. "It's trying to break you," Orwyn said, his tone harsh but steady. "Ignore its tricks. Focus on what is real." I nodded weakly, forcing myself to stand. My mind still burned with the sight of the abyss, but I followed Orwyn forward.
"I am working on it,"
Orwyn whispered confidingly. It was in the next chamber that the ghostly knights appeared. The room was vast and circular, its ceiling lost to darkness. At the center stood a broken altar, its stones stained black with age. As we entered, shadows rippled across the walls, taking form, knights clad in dark armor, their visors empty but for faint, glowing pinpricks of light. Their swords gleamed, wicked and sharp, as they stepped forward in perfect unison. "The knights," I breathed, "the ones from the Black Crusade." Orwyn raised his staff, his voice hard. "They are remnants, spirits bound to the chalice. They will not let us pass." The knights charged. I barely had time to raise my dagger as one swept toward me, its blade crashing against stone as I dodged to the side. I struck wildly, my blade skittering off its armor, but the knight did not falter. Its empty gaze turned to me, and it swung again. Orwyn roared an incantation, and a wave of light erupted from his staff, driving the knights back for a moment. "Move!" he cried. "We cannot fight them all." We ran, the knights' footsteps a thunderous drumbeat behind us. I stumbled through the archway on the far side of the chamber, my breath ragged as Orwyn slammed his staff into the ground, collapsing part of the tunnel behind us. The knights' cries echoed through the darkness, their rage palpable. At last, we found ourselves in a vast, sloping tunnel. The air was heavier now, the hum of the chalice louder, a heartbeat that pulsed through the very walls. "We're close," Orwyn said, his voice tight. "The chalice lies ahead." "What now?" I asked, my heart pounding. He turned to me, his expression hard. "Now, we face the horrors it has saved for last." I gripped my dagger tightly, the hume of the chalice filling my ears. Whatever lay ahead, whatever final guardians the chalice had summoned, I would face them. A glass on the table caught my attention, and I would end it, even if it meant facing the darkest parts of myself. Chapter 21. The Chalice of Mornieux. The air at the heart of the labyrinth was heavier than stone, so thick with corruption it felt as though I breathed tar into my lungs. The tunnel's walls pulsed faintly, as though the very earth itself was alive, thrumming with a heartbeat that was not my own. Each step forward felt harder than the last, as though unseen hands pulled at my cloak, begging me to turn back. And yet I pressed on. Orwyn moved beside me, his staff glowing faintly, though the light barely pierced the darkness that swallowed us. "We are here," he murmured, his voice hushed and reverent, though not with awe, with dread. The tunnel opened into a cavern unlike anything I had ever seen. I froze, my breath catching as I took it in. The chamber was vast, carved by no mortal hands. The walls curved like the ribs of some massive, ancient beast, stretching high into blackness that no light could touch. At its center stood the Black Chalice of Mornieux. It was grotesque, alive. Taller than a man, its surface gleamed obsidian and oily, shifting with shapes I could not quite comprehend. Symbols of chaos writhed across it, their lines pulsing like veins beneath dark skin. From its mouth, dark energy rose like smoke, curling into the air and dispersing as though seeking something, or someone. Around the chalice lay bones, thousands of bones, some ancient, others fresh, their dark stains a testament to the blood spilled to keep the chalice sated. And as I looked upon it, I heard its voice, soft at first, like a lover's whisper. "Alienne." I flinched, stumbling back as the sound slithered into my ears, curling into my mind like a parasite. Exercise helps with anxiety, Quinn said. Orwyn placed a hand on my shoulder, steadying me. It knows you. What is it saying? I whispered, though part of me already knew. Do not listen, Orwyn commanded sharply, his grip tightening. Its voice is poison. Focus on why we are here. We stepped into the chamber, the sound of our footsteps swallowed by the hum of the chalice. With each step closer, the whispers grew louder. I can free you, Alienne. Your pain can end, your suffering can be joy. The chalice's voice shifted and twisted. It was neither man nor woman, yet somehow both. A voice made of shadow and silk. A voice that spoke the deepest desires of the soul. I pressed my hands to my ears, gritting my teeth. It's inside my head. Orwyn lifted his staff and its light flared, shoving back the shadows clinging to the chamber. Resist it, he growled. Its power is strongest here. It will offer you promises. But they are all lies. Lies? The chalice cooed, its voice echoing through the cavern. The symbols on its surface flared, glowing with a sickly violet light. No, I offer truth. You see him now, don't you? Your beloved husband, broken, desperate. He could not resist me. But you are strong. You could wield me. The shadows along the chamber floor moved, twisting upward until they formed him. The Aurelien. He stepped from the blackness, his armor dark and blood-stained, his face pale and hollow, his silver eyes fixed on me, unblinking. And his voice was soft as he spoke. Mornieux, I froze, my heart hammering in my chest. Aurelien. He stepped closer, his movements slow but certain, like a predator drawing near its prey. You do not understand what you are doing. The chalice cannot be destroyed. Its power sustains this place. It keeps the land from falling into darkness. The land is darkness, I spat, though my voice trembled. And you are its servant. He stopped, his face hardening. I do this for you. For us. If you destroy the chalice, you will unleash something far worse. It will consume you. Enough of your lies, Orwyn shouted, slamming his staff into the stone. A wave of light burst outward, shattering the shadowed figure of Aurelien into smoke. The voice of the chalice screamed, 1,000 voices shrieking as one. The cavern trembled. Orwyn turned to me, his voice harsh and urgent. We must act now. The chalice is weakest when it is revealed, but it will not let us destroy it without a fight. Are you ready? I nodded, though my hands shook. What must I do? Orwyn's face was grim. The chalice is bound by blood. To break it, you must sever its link to the Mornieux line. I felt the dagger at my side grow heavier. What does that mean? Orwyn hesitated, his expression pained. It means a blood sacrifice. Yours, Aurelien's. I froze, his words striking me like a blade. You never told me that. Christ. Would it have changed your path? He demanded. The chalice will not die quietly, Alienne. To end its power, you must spill the blood of one bound to it. You carry no mourning of blood, but Aurelien does. He is the key. My breath caught. I would have to. Yes, Orwyn said sharply, and you must decide now, because it is awakening. The chalice's surface pulsed violently now, its dark energy swelling like a storm. The cavern walls groaned, cracks splitting the stone as tendrils of shadow erupted from the chalice's mouth, slashing through the air like whips. Bones scattered as the tendrils struck the ground, the sound of them cracking and breaking, filling the air. "Alienne," the chalice screamed, its voice now monstrous, its whispers replaced by rage. "You will not destroy me." Orwyn raised his staff, his voice rising in a booming incantation. Light erupted from him, meeting the shadows and holding them back. For now. "Go," he shouted at me. "Strike it. Break its hold while you still can." I answered. I stumbled forward, the dagger trembling in my hand as the tendrils writhed and slashed around me. My ears rang with the chalice's cries, its voice slamming into my mind. After the thundering thuds, I gripped the dagger tighter and fought my way back inside my own mind. Was I being transformed too? "I can make you powerful. I can make you eternal." I screamed, forcing myself onward. I reached the chalice, its surface rippling and writhing as though alive. It was alive, its black light reflected in my eyes as I raised the dagger, my heart pounding. I felt something clear her throat. She screamed. Orwyn's voice echoed behind me. "Aurelien must die, Alienne. The blood of his line must flow." I faltered. Aurelien. My husband, the man I had once loved, now a servant to this darkness. Could I do it? Could I take his life to end the curse? The cavern shuddered, and I felt Aurelien's presence behind me. I turned, and there he stood, his sword drawn, his expression dark but pained. "You don't have to do this," he said softly. Tears burned my eyes as I gripped the dagger, torn between love and hatred, between pity and fury. "You've already chosen," I whispered. And as the chalice screamed and shadows coiled around us, I knew the choice would break me. It was a powerful feeling to be in time, but it had to be made. Chapter 22. Aurelie's Choice. The air was chaos. Shadows writhed and screamed around me, pulled from the cavern walls like living smoke. The ground trembled as if the earth itself were protesting what was about to happen. At the center of it all stood the Black Chalice, pulsing, breathing, a grotesque beacon of corruption. Its dark energy spiraled upward, twisting through the cavern like tendrils reaching for a storm. I could hear Orwyn shouting behind me, his voice breaking through the chaos as he called out incantations to push back the creeping shadows. But his light was waning, and I knew that whatever strength he possessed could not hold back the chalice's will forever. And then he appeared. From the swirling darkness emerged Aurelien. I froze. The man who stepped into the light was no longer fully human. His form was warped, his tall frame encased in blackened armor that seemed to ripple like liquid, the sigils of chaos glowing faintly across its surface. The helm was gone, revealing a face that was almost my husband's, though it was grotesquely marred. Shadows crawled across his skin, and his once pale eyes now burned with an unnatural silver light. His features were sharp, gaunt, his jaw lined with thin veins of black that pulsed as though feeding him from within. Chaos clung to him like a second skin, and yet his voice, when he spoke, was still Aurelien's. "Alienne." I staggered back, raising the dagger in trembling hands as he stepped toward me, his movements eerily fluid. "Stay back," I choked. "Do not come near me." He stopped, his corrupted hands lifting slightly in a placating gesture. "Please," he said softly, his voice carrying through the madness. "I do not mean to harm you." "You are harm," I spat, my words trembling. "You are a part of this. You fed it. I did what I had to," Alienne interrupted sharply, though his voice broke with something close to desperation. "You do not understand, Alienne. You cannot." "Then help me understand," I screamed over the roar of the shadows. "Tell me why you would serve this This thing. He flinched, his silver eyes meeting mine, something human still flickering behind the chaos-touched corruption. I do not serve it willingly. It has bound me as it bound my ancestors. I tried to hold it back, to contain it. By sacrificing innocent lives, I shouted, my fury breaking free. By feeding it blood? Yes, he roared, the cavern shaking with the force of his voice. Because it is the only way, Alienne. If I do not feed the chalice, the pact will shatter, and it will unleash horrors you cannot even fathom. The land will fall into madness, the dead will rise without end, and the forest will consume everything. He stepped closer, his armored hand outstretched toward me. I have delayed it, held the worst of it at bay. Without the chalice, the demon will awaken. Do you not see? Demons. I shook my head, tears burning in my eyes. And how long can you keep it at bay, Aurelien? How long until it devours you? Until you are nothing but a pawn of chaos? I don't have many options. Adam won't let me do what you asked me to do. I raised my head from the newspaper. He faltered, his expression twisting with pain. I can resist it. I have resisted it. But you are undoing everything. If you destroy the chalice, you will damn this land. You will doom us all. For a moment there was silence between us, silence broken only by the hum of the chalice and the groaning of the cavern walls. I looked at him, at the man who had once been my husband, and I saw the truth etched across his corrupted form. He lowered his head slowly and swallowed. His suffering, his desperation, and his fear. You are already lost, I whispered. Aurelien's gaze snapped to mine, and I saw something break within him. No, he said, his voice cracking. Not yet. I still fight. For you. For us. His mouth twitched, and he broke into a half-smile. There is no us, Aurelien, I said, my voice trembling. There never was. You brought me here to feed it, didn't you? To serve as its sacrifice. His face contorted, shame and anguish warring with the dark influence that pulsed within him. I thought I could protect you, he said hoarsely. I thought I could keep you safe. But the chalice, it wants you. It has always wanted you. Your strength, your soul, it would make you eternal. You sound like it, I spat, tears streaking my face. You let it whisper its lies into your heart. You let it twist you. And now you are trying to twist me. I am saving you, he roared, his voice ringing through the cavern, his armored form trembling with rage and despair. You think you can destroy it, but you do not know the cost. Blood, Alienne. Your blood. It will demand a sacrifice, and it will not stop until it has it. I stared at him, the dagger trembling in my hand. Then let it have me. And I tilted my chin formally. Passion. Caliber. Passion is a constant friend in crisis. Constant. Aurelien's silver eyes widened, his face stricken. No. Yes, I said, my voice steady. If that is the price, then so be it. But I will not let it endure. I will not let your family's curse consume this land any longer. No! Aurelien cried, striding toward me, his movements almost unnatural. You do not understand what you are saying. Stepping back to stare into his eyes, I backed toward the chalice, its dark energy now a torrent of sound and light, screaming in my mind. I understand perfectly, Aurelien. For centuries this thing has fed on the blood of the innocent. It ends now. You cannot. Alienne, he cried, his voice breaking as the darkness rippled around him. "Please." "Thank you." But I had already made my choice. The chalice's surface rippled violently as I stepped toward it, its dark whispers rising into a deafening roar. The dagger felt heavy in my hand, its cold edge biting into my palm. Orwyn's voice echoed faintly behind me, rising in desperate incantation as the shadows swarmed. "Now, Alienne. Do it. Strike it down." I turned one last time to look at Aurelien. He stood motionless, his hands half outstretched toward me, his silver eyes wide with desperation and fear. For a moment, I saw the man I had married, buried beneath the corruption that clung to him like a shroud. "Forgive me," I whispered. Then I drove the dagger into my palm. The blood welled quickly, hot and thick, dripping onto the chalice's dark surface. The moment it touched, the cavern screamed. The symbols carved into the chalice flared, and a blast of raw energy erupted outward, knocking me back. The chalice trembled violently, its surface cracking, its voice shrieking into the air in 1,000 anguished cries. "No, you cannot." The ground splintered, the chamber shuddering as if the world itself were breaking apart. "Alienne!" I heard Aurelien's voice, raw and desperate, as I fell to my knees, clutching my bleeding hand. The chalice's cries grew louder, louder still, until they drowned out everything else. "Sorry." Silent. The chalice fractured. Its dark surface shattered into shards that fell like black glass, scattering across the cavern floor. Its light dimmed, and the shadows writhed one last time before they dissolved into nothing. The hume was gone. The darkness was gone. Almost lost sight of. The chalice was dead. I looked up, my vision swimming. Aurelien stood frozen at the center of the cavern, his corrupted form slack, his silver eyes wide and hollow. His armor cracked and darkened, pieces of it crumbling to dust as the chalice's power was stripped away. He met my gaze one last time, his voice a broken whisper. "Alienne." Then he fell to his knees, and the shadows took him. I sank to the ground, tears streaming down my face, my blood still pooling at my feet. It was gone. It was done. The Black Chalice of Mornieux was no more, and Aurelien, my husband, was gone. Chapter 23. The Breaking. The cavern trembled, its ancient bones groaning as the Black Chalice roared with life. Darkness surged from its fractured surface, the cracks pulsing like veins, spreading corruption across the stone. Shadows leapt and danced, taking on grotesque forms, twisting through the air like smoke given purpose. At the center of it all stood Margot Aurelien, or Steward Aurelien. He was no longer the man I had known. Chaos had claimed him fully. His armor writhed as if alive, the sigils of Slaanesh glowing like molten iron across its blackened surface. His form had grown monstrous, his arms stretched unnaturally, his fingers ending in wicked talons. Shadows clung to him like a cloak, curling and twisting as though part of his flesh. His face, oh, his face. It was a mockery of what it once was. His silver eyes burned with an unholy light, and his mouth twisted into something between a grimace and a smile. And yet, within that monstrous visage, there was still something human. "Alienne," Aurelien said, his voice an echo of what it had been, twisting between the man I knew and the Daemon he served. "You do not have to do this." I gripped Genevieve's dagger, the blood from my earlier wound drying on the hilt. The cavern felt alive around me, heaving, breathing, as though the chalice itself was aware of what was happening. the pulsing light reflected in my eyes. But I held my ground. "You are not Aurelien," I said softly, though my voice trembled. "Not anymore."
Thou!
"I am Aurelien," he roared, his voice deepening into something inhuman. The shadows around him lashed out like whips, cracking the stone beneath them. "I am everything you loved, everything you swore to stand beside, and yet you turn on me." "I turn on chaos," I replied, lifting the dagger, "and I will end this curse." Despite his fear, Sinclair decided to take the dagger from my hand. His monstrous eyes narrowed, and his mouth curled into a bitter, corrupted smile. "Then you will die, Alienne." He charged. I barely had time to throw myself to the side as Aurelien's talons smashed into the stone where I had stood, splintering it like glass. Shadows erupted from the cracks, twisting toward me as though alive. I scrambled back, slashing wildly at the writhing tendrils, my heartbeat deafening in my ears. "Orwyn!" I screamed, my voice echoing off the cavern walls. The hedge wizard stood at the edge of the chamber, his staff glowing fiercely with white light. He was chanting, his voice sharp and deliberate, each word pulling power into the staff's gnarled head. "Keep him away from the chalice!" Orwyn roared, the light from his staff clashing with the darkness. "You must keep him back while I shatter its connection." I turned just in time to see Aurelien lunging toward me again, his movements unnaturally fast. I barely dodged, his talons grazing my shoulder and tearing through my cloak. Pain seared through me, but I forced myself to stand, stumbling to my feet. "Aurelien," I cried, my voice shaking. "Fight it! Resist it!" Clinging to his arms, I began to scream. "I cling." For a brief moment his monstrous face faltered, the silver fire in his eyes flickering. His claws lowered, and I saw it, the man, trapped beneath the corruption. "Alienne," he rasped, his voice softer, almost broken. I tried." The shadows surged again, and the brief flicker of humanity was swallowed. Aurelien screamed, the sound splitting the air like glass. The shadows twisted around him, hardening into barbed shapes, and he charged once more. I ducked beneath a sweep of his claws, slashing at him with the dagger. The blade bit into his side, and dark ichor spilled from the wound, sizzling as it hit the stone. He howled in pain, stumbling back, and for a moment I thought I had weakened him. But the chalice pulsed then, an echoing, furious heartbeat, and the shadows answered its call. Dark tendrils erupted from the floor, lashing toward me. One struck my arm, knocking the dagger from my hand, sending it skittering across the stone. "No!" I gasped, scrambling backward as the tendrils wrapped around my ankle, dragging me toward the chalice. Its voice thundered in my mind, cruel and triumphant. "You will join us, Alienne. You were always meant to serve. So I've decided to build a dive bar in my high school's curriculum." "Good for you." A burst of white light exploded from his staff, cutting through the darkness. The tendrils recoiled, shrieking as they fell back into the floor. I staggered to my feet, clutching my bleeding arm as Orwyn's voice reached me. "Alienne, you must strike the chalice, now." I looked toward the chalice. Its surface rippled violently, cracks spreading across it as Orwyn's spell tore at its foundation. Energy erupted from its mouth like smoke, and I could feel the raw wrongness of it. Chaos, screaming in rage as its tether to the world weakened. Aurelien stood before it, his form hunched, his breathing ragged. Shadows poured from his back like wings, but his steps were slow, faltering. I knew the chalice was fighting for control, pushing him to defend it as its final guardian. He snatched up the dagger, turning toward him. "Aurelien," I shouted, "you must let me destroy it." He lifted his head, the silver fire in his eyes flickering again. "No," he groaned, his voice choked with pain. "If you destroy it, the land, it will fall." "Chaos has already taken the land," I screamed back, tears burning in my eyes. "Let me end this." His claws twitched at his sides, his form shuddering. For one desperate moment I thought he might step aside, but then the chalice pulsed, its will crashing over us like a wave. Aurelien roared, the last shred of his humanity burning away as the shadows consumed him fully. "Then you will die, Alienne." He lunged toward me. I met his charge head-on, my scream of defiance drowning out the chalice's roar. I ducked beneath his swipe, my movements fueled by desperation. The dagger in my hand seemed to glow faintly, its edge sharp and sure as I drove it into his side. Deeper this time. Aurelien howled, his monstrous form collapsing to his knees. "Alienne," Orwyn shouted. "Strike the chalice." I turned toward the Black Chalice. Its surface was splitting now, fractures spidering outward as light and darkness warred within it. I ran, my body screaming with exhaustion, the dagger slick with Aurelien's blood. As I reached it, the chalice spoke again, its voice shrieking into my mind. "You cannot destroy me. I will offer you power, eternity. For eternity, allow us to cross the iron gate of Cyrest and challenge the undead." "Be silent," I hissed through gritted teeth. I raised the dagger high above my head, every nerve in my body screaming as the chalice's dark energy lashed against me. "Oh!" And I struck. The blade pierced the chalice, driving into its heart with a sickening crack. A wave of force erupted outward, throwing me backward as the chalice shattered, its pieces exploding into a storm of black glass and searing light. The cavern shook violently. Shadows screamed as they dissolved into nothingness, the raw power of chaos pulled back into the void. I lay on the cold stone floor, gasping for breath, the world spinning. Orwyn staggered to my side, his staff flickering faintly as he leaned on it for support. "It is done," he rasped, his voice hollow with exhaustion. I turned my head and saw Aurelien lying where he had fallen, his form broken. His corrupted armor was cracked and crumbling, the shadows around him dissolving like smoke. His silver eyes, now human once more, met mine, and for the first time in what felt like an eternity, I saw peace there. "Alienne," he whispered, his voice faint. "You were stronger than I." Tears blurred my vision as I reached for him, but his form crumbled to ash beneath my touch, carried away by the wind of the chalice's breaking. Gwyn slowly reached up to put his hand on the top of mine, forming the words, until finally I could make nothing of it at all. I sat in silence, my hand still outstretched, the cavern now empty, save for bones and dust. The Black Chalice of Mornieux was no more. And so too was my husband. The curse was broken, but the price had been steep. And as I knelt there, surrounded by shadows that would never rise again, I understood one bitter truth. Some victories come at the cost of the heart itself. Chapter 24. The Keep's Collapse. The air split apart. The very earth beneath Château du Mornieux screamed as though it too had suffered centuries of torment. The shattering of the Black Chalice unleashed a force beyond comprehension, raw, chaotic energy that surged outward like a tempest. For a moment the world seemed to hold its breath, and then the cavern began to fall. I staggered to my feet, my vision blurred, my ears ringing with the echoes of chaos breaking. Orwyn was beside me, leaning on his staff, his face pale and streaked with sweat. The cavern shuddered, cracks racing up the walls and through the stone arches above. Chunks of rock splintered, raining down in heavy bursts of dust and debris. "Alienne, we must move." Orwyn's voice was hoarse but urgent. I turned, my heart breaking anew as I looked toward the center of the chamber. Aurelien, what remained of him, was on his knees, his corrupted form crumbling like dry ash. The dark armor that had bound him twisted and flaked away, the sigils carved into it dimming as the chalice's power was torn from him. He lifted his head to look at me. His silver eyes, human once more, were filled with sorrow, and something I could only describe as peace. Alienne, he whispered. His voice was faint, hollow, but it was his voice. The man I had once loved, no longer twisted by chaos. I fell to my knees beside him, tears streaking my face. Aurelien, hold on. Please. He reached out, his hand trembling as his skin crumbled to dust beneath my touch. It is done, he said softly. You have freed me. You have freed us all. The cavern shook violently, a thunderous crack splitting through the earth as a massive fissure opened behind him. The dark energy that had sustained the chalice poured into the void, pulling everything into its depths. His heart grinded. No, I cried, grasping for him, but my fingers closed around nothing but ash. Aurelien smiled, soft, faint, human, before his form collapsed fully. The last fragments of him carried away on the wind of the void. I screamed his name, my voice lost beneath the roar of the collapsing cavern. No. Orwyn grabbed my arm, pulling me roughly to my feet. We must go, Alienne, now. I stumbled after him, my body numb, my heart shattering with every step. The cavern was coming apart, the ground splitting and shifting beneath our feet as chaos energy bled into the air like smoke. Tendrils of darkness slashed through the chamber, lashing at the stone and dragging everything into the abyss. The tunnel that led us here was already beginning to collapse, the ceiling crumbling in great sheets of rock. "Faster!" Orwyn shouted, his voice barely audible above the chaos. We ran. The lantern in Orwyn's hand flickered wildly, its light barely holding back the darkness as we scrambled through the shifting tunnels. Behind us, I could hear the roar of destruction, walls splitting, stone falling, as though the château itself were screaming in its death throes. Recovering, I waded down the dark stairway, silent bowing to the ticking time clock. "Keep moving," Orwyn yelled, his staff glowing faintly as he sent bursts of magic to hold back collapsing sections of the tunnel. I tripped, falling hard onto my knees as the earth shook violently beneath me. My hand scraped against the stone, but I forced myself to rise, tears blinding me as I stumbled forward. I will not die here. The whisper of my own thoughts felt hollow as the ground cracked and trembled, stone raining down around us in jagged shards. Newang said, "Axha saw me retreat." The ascent felt endless. The tunnels twisted and crumbled, paths that once led upward now blocked by walls of debris. Orwyn forged ahead, his light cutting through the suffocating dark. Every breath was agony, dust choking the air, my lungs burning with each inhale. Finally, as my legs began to fail me, I saw it, a faint light ahead, the world beyond, the surface. "Orwyn," I gasped, pointing toward it. He turned, his face smeared with grime but alive with determination. "Go! Run!" Together we surged forward, the last stretch of the tunnel collapsing behind us with a thunderous roar. My vision narrowed, the light growing closer, brighter, until we burst through the broken earth and into the night air. I fell to the ground, gasping, my body trembling as I tried to fill my lungs with the cold, misty air of the outside world. Behind us, Château de Mornieux groaned one final time. I turned to see it, its towers sagging, its walls splitting and collapsing inward as though consumed by a force that could no longer be contained. Dark smoke rose from its depths, curling into the night sky like the dying breath of something ancient and foul. The earth beneath the chateau split wide, swallowing its remains piece by piece, until nothing remained but a gaping wound in the land. The whispers were gone. The hum of chaos was gone. The curse was gone. I sat on the damp grass, staring at the ruin where the chateau had once stood, my mind blank and hollow. Aurelien was gone. The Black Chalice was destroyed. The land, though broken, was free. Frost came from the frozen breeze spattering on my furry outfit, and the blast of hail gusted through. Orwin dropped to his knees beside me, leaning heavily on his staff. For a long time, neither of us spoke. Finally, his voice broke the silence. "It is over." I nodded, though the words rang hollow in my heart. My husband was dead. The man I had tried to save had been lost to chaos, and though his final moments were his own, I could not shake the image of him crumbling to ash before me. "I have nothing left," I whispered, my voice trembling. Orwyn turned to look at me, his pale eyes softening. "You have your life, Alienne, and you have given this land a chance to heal." I shook my head, tears streaming silently down my face. At what cost? Orwyn said nothing, and for a time we sat in silence, watching as the mist rolled over the ruins of Château du Mornieux. The land around me was quiet now, eerily so. The air no longer carried the weight of whispers. The shadows no longer moved of their own accord. For the first time, the forest beyond was still. And yet, as I sat there beneath the vast, uncaring sky, I felt as though I, too, had been shattered. The curse was broken, but it had left its mark on the land, on the souls of those it had claimed, and on me. The Château de Mornieux was no more, and Lady Alienne of Mornieux would carry its ghosts forever. Chapter 25. The Aftermath. Months had passed, yet it felt as though the final night beneath Château de Mornieux had only just ended. The destruction still haunted my dreams. The shattering of the Black Chalice, the screams of the shadows, and the sight of Aurelien as he crumbled to ash before me. I had returned to the land, to the ruins that once crowned this cursed place, seeking something I could not name. Perhaps it was closure, perhaps it was absolution, but I knew the truth. I came to remind myself that it was real. The chateau was gone. In its place stood a ruin, a scar in the land, raw and broken, its stone foundations jutting like the bones of some long-dead beast. Vines had begun to crawl over the rubble, creeping through the cracks, reclaiming what chaos had stolen. Grass sprouted through the ruined stonework, and the forest, once silent and malevolent, seemed to breathe again. Birds returned to the trees. Insects hummed softly beneath the fragile sunlight. The land was healing, and yet shadows lingered. I stood at the edge of the ruin, the wind tugging at my cloak as I gazed down into the gaping wound that marked where the Black Chalice had once pulsed with dark life. There was nothing left of it now, no sign of its corruptive power, but the air still carried a faint chill, a whisper of something waiting, watching. Chaos does not die. It only slumbers. Orwyn had left weeks ago, disappearing into the forests that bordered the land. "My task here is done," he had said, leaning heavily on his staff. "But yours may not be. Chaos never rests, Alienne. The world will need those willing to fight its return." I had watched him go, his figure swallowed by the mists, his words ringing in my mind. I did not know if I would see him again. Perhaps he, like me, had simply become a shadow in the aftermath, a relic of a war few would ever understand. The villagers had begun to return as well, cautiously reclaiming the lands that had been theirs before the Mornieux name became a curse. Fields were tilled, broken fences mended, and simple lives resumed. They did not speak of the château. They did not speak of me. To them I was a ghost, a woman who had walked into the dark and returned, changed. Perhaps they were right. I wandered through what remained of the grounds, my feet brushing the remnants of shattered stone. Here had been the great hall. There, the chapel where the saints once stood watch before their faces were defiled. All gone, all dust. And yet, when I closed my eyes, I could still hear it. The hum of the chalice, the whispers in the walls. Aurelien's voice, calling my name. I had loved him once. Perhaps some part of me still did. The man he had been, before the shadows, was a flicker of what might have been. But chaos had claimed him, just as it had claimed so many before, and I had been the one to end it. I knelt at the center of the ruin, where the stone still bore faint stains of blood, my blood, his blood, the blood of all those the chalice had consumed. The wind sighed softly, carrying with it the faintest echoes of voices long gone. I whispered to the silence, my voice trembling, "I am sorry, for Alienne, for the servants and villagers whose lives had been stolen, for myself." As the sun dipped lower on the horizon, I rose to my feet, my resolve hardening. The land was free, for now. But I had seen the true nature of chaos, the way it crept into the hearts of men and twisted their wills, until they no longer recognized themselves. Orwyn had been right. The chalice was destroyed, but its corruption was not so easily undone. There would be others like it, artifacts, cults, whispers in forgotten corners of the world. Chaos could not be truly defeated, but it could be fought. I had learned that strength is not in silence, nor in ignorance. It is in choosing to act, even when all hope seems lost. And drew Genevieve's dagger from my belt, its edge still stained with faint marks of the battles it had seen. The weapon was simple, but it had served me well. "I swear," I whispered into the wind, the words carried into the ruins and beyond. "As long as I draw breath, I will fight this curse. I will hunt its remnants, wherever they may hide." The wind rose in response, brushing against my face like the faintest acknowledgement. I did not know if it was the land itself, or merely my own mind giving answer, but I would not turn back. I left the ruins as twilight fell, the mists curling softly around me as I walked away from the shadow of Château de Mornieux. Bergiton. I no longer belonged to the world of noble halls and silken gowns. I was something else now, something forged in shadow and blood, shaped by loss and tempered by resolve. The curse was broken, but chaos remained, and I would be ready. As I disappeared into the mist, I whispered a final prayer to the Lady of the Lake, though I doubted she still listened to one like me. Damn, let me be their blade in the dark. And the land fell silent, save for the distant cry of a crow, a reminder that though the night was quiet, the darkness would always return. When it did, I would be waiting. Lady Alienne of Mornieux, the last of her name, the hunter of shadows.